Ranmaru Kageyama is probably one of the most, if not the most popular of the dummies that appear in Chapter 3 of Your Turn to Die. And the first reason for that most likely being that at the very beginning of Chapter 3 he gets partnered up with Sarah, and so he's the first dummy that the player really gets to know and spend time with. And later on throughout the rest of the story he still remains relevant and quite present. Now, the other reason for why Ranmaru is so popular and the thing he's most known for is of course that he kills the remaining Yabusama siblings, so either Reko or Alice, depending on which one of them is alive at that point, in the logic route, also known as the soul lives route. Now, I do think that it's definitely good for this type of a story to include a character that's actually willing to directly kill other people for the sake of their own survival, and to have the character actually go through with it. However, I do have one issue with this whole thing, and that's that the game doesn't really go too deeply into why Ranmaru did what he did. Of course, we know that he wanted to survive and that he wanted to win alongside Sarah and save Sarah due to his infatuation with her, but personally, I don't believe that's all there was to it, because, well, it doesn't really make that much sense to me, because Ranmaru didn't really know Sarah that well, or for that long. And even in the scene where she is manipulating him during their conversation in the classroom, she eventually snaps out of it and she tells him not to go through with it, to forget about what happened, what she said, and not to listen to that, and that killing the others is wrong. But he does go through with it, which to me shows that he also wanted to do that for himself, regardless of what Sarah actually thought about it, and was most likely using Sarah's will to survive as sort of a justification that it's okay because he's doing it for Sarah and not just for himself. Another thing is that the Ranmaru we first meet doesn't really seem like he'd do that kind of thing, especially not for the attention of the girl he likes. I mean, of course, first impressions can be wrong. However, he is the most cooperative out of the dummies at first. He's the one who first expresses the will to help Kitaro. He's the one who first says they should also try to save Keiji. So that brings us to the question, what changes? Did something happen to make him change his mind? Well, it did actually. First, I wanted to bring your attention to something that Ranmaru says in the discussion room. He asks Sarah if she really thinks she'd be able to kill Midori, and when Sarah is surprised by that question, Ranmaru explains that even though he can't really sympathize with someone like Midori, he can't help but to see him as human if he's moving around. Well, that's interesting, and that's what I believe was the reason Ranmaru saw killing even Midori as something wrong, because he considered it wrong for a human to kill another human. And I think that's what changes. Not the idea that it's wrong for a human to kill human, but his perception of what makes a human. Now you may think, okay, hold on. Ranmaru's victim wasn't at all. It's either Alice or Reko, so undeniably humans. Well, yes, but let's focus on who the killer is. Ranmaru himself, so very much a doll. And a very important thing that happens to Ranmaru that we see affect him visibly is his realization that he isn't human, and him having to finally confront that fact. When he realizes that he really is a doll, he's visibly shaken and shocked by that, and he even admits that deep down he still felt like he was human. And while Chapter 3 doesn't really touch upon that the way Chapter 2 did with fake Reko, what comes with the realization that he isn't human must also be that Ranmaru realizes that he isn't the real Ranmaru Kageyama. He's just a copy of a person who was real and is already dead. Now, copies are supposed to be the same, but there is one difference between the doll Ranmaru and the human Ranmaru, and that's something that Sarah actually mentions in Emotion Route, which is that she gave Ranmaru the will to live, but before, he had already given up. And that's something we can see with the real Ranmaru from his victim video. His reaction to dying is just, man, that sucks ass, but he doesn't really try to fight it, or he's not as miserable or shaken by it like the other victims were. He just kind of lets it happen, and even admits that his life wasn't anything special really. The Ranmaru we know finds a will to live, and doesn't want to die. Quite the opposite, reacts very emotionally when he thinks about the possibility of dying. And that's the first thing that sets him apart from the real Ranmaru. And what comes with it, it's the first thing that makes him his own person. So it would make sense why he'd cling onto that will to live so strongly. Another thing that the human Ranmaru lacked was a purpose. And what we see the Ranmaru do is find a purpose. And that purpose is to protect Sarah, who is the very same person who helped him find that will to live. It's also quite important to note that at the very beginning, Midori makes it clear that the dummies are inferior to humans, and the dummies' purpose is to serve as obstacles for the remaining survivors. Of course, at first, it just looks like they're supposed to help them, but even then, it's made quite clear by Midori that they're not supposed to be equals. And well, Ranmaru doesn't want to be an obstacle for Sarah because he wants her to survive. So instead he chooses the other option, which is to make himself a tool for her. It's something we can also see quite clearly during their conversation in the classroom, because even when Ranmaru brings up the idea of winning at the cost of everyone else's lives, it does sound like he's expecting right away that Sarah won't want to do it and she won't be directly a part of it. He says stuff like, you don't want to hurt your allies, so it would be something I would do all on my own, I'll handle it skillfully. It's almost like he insists that Sarah isn't a part of it. Why? Because Sarah has a heart, because she has a conscience, she has feelings, she's human. Ranmaru doesn't have a heart. He's not human. He does have feelings, but they're not really his own feelings, are they? They're feelings of the Ranmaru Kageyama, who doesn't exist anymore because he died, and who the dual Ranmaru isn't. So while it's not okay for Sarah to kill her allies, because it's not okay for a human to be hurting other humans and destroy themselves through it, it's okay for Ranmaru to do it, because Ranmaru is not human, he's just a tool, he can be used as a weapon, that's his purpose. Actually, that's what the dummies were made for. They're supposed to hurt. He's just choosing who he will hurt instead of Sarah. And that's how I believe he justifies the murder to himself. I don't think he's completely indifferent to what he's doing. I think he must have felt guilty, but I also think that for all the reasons that I mentioned, he was able to ignore it and convince himself to go through it anyway. And ironically enough, it must have come from a place of desperation and selfishness as well, because he's fine sacrificing the others, but he wants to survive with Sarah and live even though he's not a human and he's just a tool. So what pushes him to do that stuff are, well, emotions and human weakness, very much unlike something just an object would do. But I think it's definitely easier for Ranmaru to kill Alice or Rako if he thinks of himself as just an object, and that's why I believe Ranmaru ended up committing murder. Of course, that's my own interpretation of his character and his actions, and I might be wrong. So feel free to share your own thoughts about Ranmaru and what led to his downfall in the logic route.